Welcome to meeting number 50 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The committee is meeting today to continue its study on foreign election interference. Today we have with us Mr. David Mulrooney, Charles Burton, and from Media Smarts, Matthew Johnson on Zoom. And we have made sure that the sound check and everything has been done. Charles Burton is the Senior Fellow, Centre for Advancing Canada's Interests Abroad at the Macdonald Laurier Institute. And David Mulrooney is the former Ambassador of Canada to the People's Republic of China. And I've mentioned that Matthew Johnson is Director of Education, Media Smarts. So we will have up to 5 minutes for opening comments. And I will just remind all members and our guests that all comments should be made through the chair. With that, up to 5 minutes to you, Mr. Mulrooney. Welcome to PROC.
Thank you. I've traveled to Ottawa today because I believe the topic under discussion, PRC interference in our elections, is an increasingly serious problem and a key component of a broader campaign that threatens our sovereignty and the safety of our citizens. I worry that we have yet to address this threat with the urgency it deserves. I've followed your discussions carefully and have heard some members ask, why focus on China? Because China is a formidable military and economic power that, as a matter of policy, infiltrates and undermines organizations abroad perceived to be a threat to the Communist Party. Because China is also the focus of concerns about political interference in the US, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. Because I believe that Beijing's ambitions and capabilities are growing, and because many of the victims of PRC interference in Canada are members of Han Chinese, Uyghur, and Tibetan diaspora communities whom Beijing threatens with seeming impunity. Beijing's tools include bribery, disinformation, collusion with criminal gangs, and the ever-present threat of hostage-taking. And it is increasingly sophisticated in its intimidation of elected officials who dare to speak the truth to Canadians. Here in Canada, Beijing recruits proxies to parrot its talking points, expand its influence in media, on college campuses, and in government, and to launder its illicit financial contributions. The party's objective is to transform Canada into a compliant country that perpetually looks over its shoulder to be sure that what it says and does meets Beijing's approval, and looks the other way when Beijing's extraterritorial reach extends into our communities. Beijing's objective is a degree of influence in our democracy, our economy, our foreign policy, even daily life in some of our communities, beyond the ambitions of any other country. This is furthered by propagation of the falsehood that simply speaking up about PRC interference is itself racist, anti-Chinese. Beijing's Canada policy is being advanced aggressively. Although it's not too late to push back, the longer we delay, the more difficult the task becomes. I believe we need to do 4 things. First, we must understand that China is the primary threat when it comes to foreign interference in Canada. Therefore, our defenses, including election security, must be designed to counter techniques favored by Beijing, such as the use of proxies. Second, we should therefore act now to create a registry of foreign agents, something that would simply require transparency of those who disperse funds for, lobby for, or speak for foreign states in Canada. We must empower our security agencies and police to identify and bring to justice those who fail to do so. And we need to hold current and former elected officials and public servants to higher standards of transparency, accountability, and loyalty. Third, Canadian police need to be more present in diaspora communities, better informed about PRC interference, and enabled to act if they are to protect people who are being harassed and silenced by the Chinese state here in Canada. Fourth, we must be prepared to expel Chinese diplomats involved in interference or harassment. Our failure to do so only encourages increasingly brazen meddling. This will trigger retaliation, but we must make it clear that expulsion is the inevitable consequence of such hostile behavior. A defining characteristic of a truly sovereign nation is the ability to shield its citizens and its institutions from foreign interference. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Burton.
Thank you. I heartily endorse everything that Mr. Moroney has just said. And I'd like to go on to the serious allegations made in media reports that Chinese diplomats in Canada or other agents of China's Communist Party regime have been complicit in unlawful actions to influence the results of the 2019 and 2021 Canadian federal elections. Now, first of all, foreign embassies expressing their government's views on Canadian politics and our politicians is consistent with their diplomatic function, although I'd prefer that they didn't do that. And the Canadian embassy to China, on both of my diplomatic postings there earlier in my career, was doing the same sort of thing. I was involved in furthering Canada's foreign policy mandate to promote human rights, democratization, and good governance abroad, such as implementing Canadian government programming to encourage the government of China to bring China's legislative and judicial system into compliance with the UN's International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, including holding free and fair elections at all levels of the Chinese government. But the difference is that what Canada does in this regard is done by us openly and transparently, whereas China's approach, as CSIS defines it, is purposively covert and malign, designed to deceptively influence and corrupt Canada's national policies, officials, research institutions, and democratic processes. So this is very much in line with the distinctive political culture of the People's Republic of China as it's developed since the party was established by Chairman Mao and his cohort of Marxist-Leninist revolutionaries over 100 years ago. Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping, along with Chairman Mao, has identified that his party possesses what he refers to as three treasures of the Dharma, Fabao, or sometimes they translate as magical weapons. These three are, number one, party building, number two, armed struggle, and number three, the United Front. Now, the party has a United Front work department, a comprehensive work bureaucracy of over 40,000 people, plus a much larger number of agents in foreign countries and within China who collaborate with them. And the point of the United Front work department is to secretly develop and implement a strategy of carefully crafted deception about the true intentions of the Chinese Communist Party. It engages in a massive program of influence peddling, disinformation, and coercion to suppress all voices in Canada critical of the party's domestic and international policy. As it says on their website, its mandate is to rally as many allies as possible in order to defeat a common enemy. Now, as Secretary of the Chinese Embassy's Chinese Communist Party branch, the ambassador to Canada of China oversees this activity. Last December 23rd, I sent the clerk of this committee a note listing 18 recent reports and journal articles that provide authoritative data on how this works in Canada and abroad for your reference. Finally, let me note that over the weekend I pulled out my copy of Global Affairs Canada's publication entitled Diplomatic, Consular, and Other Representatives in Canada. I counted up the numbers of diplomats accredited to Canada by various countries. I just, checked them off. Japan has 46 people here. India has 35. The UK has 23. And China has 146 diplomats accredited to Canada. It does make me wonder if a significant proportion of China's exceptionally large diplomatic cohort here are engaged primarily in United Front work, monitoring agents involved in the influence peddling, disinformation, and coercion. I would imagine that CSIS would know the answer to that question, and if so, I do hope that CSIS will be prepared to share that information about the United Front work mandate of the Chinese diplomats here in Canada with this committee. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, up to 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the past few years, barely a day has gone by without disinformation making the headlines. Whether it's doctored videos of politicians or conspiracy theories about vaccines, It affects our health, our democracy, and even our ability to tell what's real and what isn't. According to one recent study, 2/3 of Canadians consider it to be a major threat to our country, nor can we hope to outgrow this problem. Young people are not necessarily better able to recognize mis or disinformation than their elders, and are more likely to encounter it in formats that make verification more difficult, such as videos, social network posts, and podcasts. While governments and industry are taking steps to address the issue, without a national commitment to digital media literacy, their efforts will have limited effect. Digital media literacy education has repeatedly been shown to be an effective way of limiting the impact of disinformation, and Canada has long been a pioneer in this field. Today, however, we've fallen behind. In Canadian schools, digital media literacy is often introduced late, relegated to optional subjects, or taught as separate topics, such as online safety, misinformation, or film studies, rather than as an integrated discipline. Adult learners might have access to only a patchwork of mostly local programs aimed at teaching basic digital skills. A recent report from the Open Society Institute underlined this decline, finding that Canada now ranks 7th in their media literacy index. Finland, the top ranked country in the study, provides the kind of model that Canada once did. The focus on digital media literacy in that country is a direct result of concerns about foreign, particularly Russian disinformation. What can Canada learn from their example? First, the importance of integrating digital media literacy across the curriculum, both as its own subject and in existing subjects. Rather than isolating it in one course or focusing on a single issue, such as fake news, the Finnish curriculum takes a comprehensive approach, from teaching how to recognize misleading statistics in math class to analyzing the visual appeal of ads or memes in art. Whether it's understanding how algorithms use our personal information to target us with election ads, recognizing bad faith arguments, or learning how to identify and question our own biases and act as responsible sharers of information, Canadians need a full range of digital media literacy skills to be engaged and informed citizens. Digital media literacy has consistently been shown to be effective in building resiliency to disinformation. One recent study found that participants who reported having studied critical thinking activities and media literacy in school were 26% less likely to believe in conspiracy theories, while other research has found that education in media literacy makes people more likely to verify information and less likely to share misinformation. Most recently, the Task Force on Disinformation and the War in Ukraine identified the need to educate people about disinformation and media literacy as one of their 10 recommendations. While curriculum in Canada is, of course, a provincial and territorial responsibility, there is room for the federal government to establish national standards for digital media literacy. On a broader scale, there's an urgent need to adopt a national digital media literacy strategy. All sectors and levels of government can collaborate to support equitable access, promote engaged citizenship and close the digital divide, provide adequate funding to develop, deliver, and evaluate digital media literacy programs, and adapt those programs to meet the needs of everyone in Canada. In order to be critical and engaged citizens, the youth in our research say they need to be able to make free and informed choices about what information platforms collect about them and how it is used, and to know how those platforms' algorithms decide what content to show them. Digital media literacy is not going to be the only solution to disinformation, but it will be part of any successful solution. While regulation, legislation, and platform policies are all likely to be parts of the solution as well, none of those will be possible without a populace that is sufficiently well informed and engaged to demand and to make use of them. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. We will start with our 6-minute round, starting with Mr. Cooper, followed by Mr. Turnbull. 6 minutes, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I'm going to direct my first question to Mr. Mulrooney. We have repeatedly seen the Prime Minister and Liberal cabinet ministers and MPs downplay Beijing's interference in our elections. Even at this committee on November 1st, a member of this committee, a parliamentary secretary, speaking on behalf of the government, said that it makes her wonder why there is such a focus on China, notwithstanding, of course, that CSIS has identified China as Canada's most significant foreign interference threat actor. Do statements such as those from the parliamentary secretary give you any confidence that this is a government that takes Beijing's interference in our elections seriously?
One of the reasons I wanted to come today was to talk about China, because I noticed that discussion of where does China fit in, and people had focused on Russia, they'd focused on other threats, and all threats they are. But China is categorically different, and we need to understand that. I was reading something that the Director General of MI5, the British security agency, the internal security agency, said, and he said, Russian interference has an effect like a bout of bad weather. So you don't want to get it, but that's what it's like. Chinese interference is like climate change. It is much more systemic. It's based on the large financial reserves that China has. It's delivered through sometimes the companies that China has seen invest in other countries. It has the capabilities, and it also has the intent, because China, I believe, sees itself in a moment in the world where it has the potential to achieve global leadership. They believe the United States is a spent force. And this is their moment, and that is driving them to be bold and exceptionally threatening. They're also very, very opportunistic and quick to pick the weakest target. And my concern is that Canada not be the weakest target, and I frankly, I have some worries on that score.
Thank you for that. Mr. Mulrooney, you were quoted in the November 7th Global News Report by Sam Cooper, which revealed that the Prime Minister was briefed by CSIS about a vast network of interference in the 2019 election, in which you said, quote, Canada is more exposed than other Western democracies to China's interference, and yet as the United States, UK, and Australia strengthen their counter-interference laws and ramp up investigations into Xi's United Front networks, Ottawa remains strangely inactive, end of quote. Can you elaborate on that comment and speak to how this government is failing to respond in the way that it needs to this level of interference by Beijing?
So I believe that China picks the path of least resistance. And right now, when you look at the Five Eyes in particular, that's Canada. New Zealand isn't much further ahead, but we're not New Zealand, and we're a more attractive target than New Zealand is. And I think if you look at the United States, Britain, and Australia in the last 2 or 3 years, they have all had what they would consider a crisis in terms of Chinese penetration of their government, their electoral systems, serious Chinese interference. The Department of Justice and the FBI talking about opening new investigations every 2 or 3, every two investigations a day, I think was the quote I saw. So they understand the threat, and they're acting. Australia has its registry of foreign agents, which requires transparency of Australians who act for foreign governments. The United States has the Foreign Agents Registration Act, but it's also taken steps to prosecute people who have been found to be interfering in the business of Congress and indeed in congressional elections. And the UK has identified a person who had been very active in British politics and funded several politicians as a foreign agent working for China. Those things send messages. We also saw recently Britain leaning on the Chinese consulate in Manchester, England, after they dragged protesters into the consulate and beat them. The result was 5 diplomats left the consulate. So they're taking action, but we aren't.
I have a question for both Mr. Mulrooney and Mr. Burton, but before I get to that, just to clarify for the record, Mr. Mulrooney, I thought I heard you say, but just to clarify that I understood you correctly, that Beijing's interference in our elections and more broadly is growing.
Is growing. And
yes.
The allegations are what concerned me about the Global News Report, and I know that they're working on elaborating the details, but the scope, if it is indeed 11 ridings just in the GTA, that would be formidable, that would be ambitious in any country. That's something we have to take note of, that growth in ambition and possibly a growth in capability.
Right, and now my question, the Liberals have often cited the establishment of the site task force and the critical election incident public protocol to say we're taking action. What do you say in response to that? Do you think that these mechanisms are sufficient to combat Beijing's interference and other foreign interference in our elections? Both Mr. Burton and Mr. Mulrooney.
Well, I think that, you know, certainly the recent election, the disinformation that was launched in particular at the Richmond-Stevenson former MP Kenny Chiu is largely in the Chinese language and, you know, largely inaccessible to people who are working on monitoring elections. In other words, you know, we don't have the capability within the Canadian system to deal with activities in the diaspora community that could affect election results improperly. So in the case of Mr. Chiu, you know, he didn't have anywhere really to turn for seeking some complaint about being slandered and mischaracterized in the Chinese language. There was no means to identify where the source of the Chinese information in WeChat came from. There was nothing in the Conservative Party or, you know, indeed within Elections Canada or even within the G7 rapid response mechanism in global affairs that was able to come to terms with this, and he was unable to respond to these allegations, which are utterly false.
Thank you. So when we hear the beep beep, it's easiest if we let the next person go. Mr. Turnbull, up to 6 minutes.
Thanks for all the witnesses for your testimony today. I appreciated your opening remarks. And I totally concur that we have to take these foreign threats seriously. And as you stated, Mr. Mulrooney, I think both of you have stated, Burton and Mulrooney have stated that this is a campaign that's over many years. And you know, what's interesting to me is somehow it seems as though from our conversations, like the Conservatives just woke up to this threat during our committee meetings and proceedings just recently, whereas I think this has been a systemic issue for quite some time. Would you not agree that this attempts at foreign interference in Canada's election process and other forms of foreign interference from China specifically have been ongoing for quite a number of years before 2019? Mr. Burton, maybe first to you.
Yes, well, under Party General Secretary Xi Jinping, since he came into power 10 years ago, he has allocated a massive increase in allocation of resources towards the United Front Work Department, and particularly their 9th and 10th Bureau, which are involved in engaging with persons of Chinese origin in foreign countries. So there has been an increase. I think that, you know, seeing as after what has happened in the previous elections, no Chinese diplomats have been declared persona non grata, and no agents of the Chinese regime have been brought before a Canadian court to be accountable for alleged criminal activity, that this emboldens the Chinese regime to do much more of it in the next election. In other words, the longer we remain passive and ineffective, the more encouraged they'll be that they can do more of this and get away with it. So,
thank you for that, and I understand that. So it's becoming more acute over time in terms of the general assumption that we're essentially not meeting this threat.
And they're putting a lot more resources into it. It's becoming a much more central part of the Chinese government's foreign policy.
Got it. And just to follow up on that with Mr. Mulrooney, just a quick question to you. You've mentioned the Registry of Foreign Agents that you've recommended. I recently just looked at an article that I think you were quoted and or published on a website here. And so maybe you could give us a little bit more information on that, and then I want to share my time with my colleague MP O'Connell. So could you speak to that a little bit more? How does that work?
What would happen, and the way it works in Australia, is that if you and the way the issues they're concerned with are dispersing money for a foreign entity that is either part of the government or controlled by the government, if you lobby for them, and some of that's caused already captured by lobbying legislation, but this is specifically for foreign governments. And if you communicate, if you deliver their talking points, you have to be transparent so that Australians or Canadians, if someone's on Power and Politics talking about foreign policy, Canadians deserve to know if that person's also being paid by a foreign state to say those things. And they certainly need to know if a politician or a public servant, either current or former, is being, or recently retired, is being paid. And so the Australian government also works to identify entities that they think are representative of foreign states, and there's an appeal process, but once that identification is made, if you work for them along those lines, you need to be transparent.
Thank you. Over to you, MP O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull, for sharing your time. Madam Chair, just through you, I'd ask that Mr. Cooper table with this committee my full quote, because I would hate for misinformation to be spread within this committee. But Mr. Burton, I want to speak quickly about the comments you made you brought up the example of Mr. Kenny Chiu and the election campaign. Were you aware of the testimony we had on this study at this committee from members of the Critical Election Incident Public Protocol that actually spoke about the process that our government put in place for the 19 and 21 elections for parties to be fully have full security clearance? And they described the process in which members or parties could actually bring specific examples. So you said that Mr. Chiu had no opportunity to actually find out what was happening, because there's also a difference between activity and impact. And so, in fact, in the description of the process with the critical incident report, they spoke about how parties could, in fact, bring really specific examples to CSIS, to the national security community. They could brief the parties. The parties could take action or inform their members. So your comments saying that there was actually no process, that would have been the case actually under the previous government. But in this instance, that Mr. Chiu actually could have raised it with his party. His party could have brought it to the national security community. They could have provided a full briefing, but in fact, they didn't, because we heard from the critical incident report that no instances were brought forward from the Conservative Party.
I think what happened in the case of Mr. Chiu was that on the same day as there was a poll that came out that showed that the Conservatives might achieve a minority government, then this massive campaign of disinformation on multiple Chinese language websites directed at people in Canada appeared. It was a matter of gathering information. I mobilized some friends in the Hong Kong community to go through the internet to try and find out where it came from, and we failed to do so. I think it's really a question of it happened too fast, and immediately Mr. Chiu's numbers started to plummet.
But
as soon as
perhaps
the
the
thing
party
came out.
should have brought that forward then,
Okay.
using that
beep, beep,
incident
beep.
report. Thank you.
Thank you. Madame Goudreau.
Ms. Gaudreau, you have up to 6 minutes. Can you hear the English interpretation? Can you hear the English? Excellent. From the outset, I'd like to give you an opportunity to provide us with any suggestions or recommendations. You mentioned Finland, for example. You mentioned digital literacy and tools, really, that we need to do a 180-degree turn on. Since 2019, I have been very interested in issues of legitimate processes, ethics, disclosure of interests. And we're really, now the cat has been let out of the bag. So I'd like to ask you a question, Mr. Mulroney. In your article, you said that for activity to be legal, there has to be disclosure that allows identification of the source. Now, I'm sure you saw the testimony of the Minister of Foreign Affairs on the 13th of December. I'd like to just quote here. She said that she had not received any information about foreign interference in the 2019 elections. And I'm quoting, She said, I'm sure you heard what the Prime Minister said about this. Now, we're talking about transparency. And we're talking about setting aside partisanship and about the responsibility of disclosure. So what do we have to do? I mean, I'm embarrassed about what's happening right now. People are watching. They're listening. We have to show them that we are going to do a 180-degree turn on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I've thought about that too, and I must say that I've followed all of your proceedings. I listened to our officials who spoke about the defenses we have against interference, and they're all very impressive and very capable people, and I know some of them. But I left with a misgiving. And my concern was sometimes when we design something, we design what we want. We don't design with a view to what actually needs fixing. We don't look at the target. We're motivated by what we enjoy doing or want to do or think is best without checking. And the impression I had after listening to about our various defenses was to think back in history to the 1930s when France constructed the Maginot Line. And it was a line, they were not going to suffer what happened to them in World War I, so they were going to build defenses that went from the borders in the Low Countries all the way down, all along the borders of France to Spain. And it was impregnable, and it gave the French great confidence, but the Germans didn't follow that plan. They had another plan. They entered via the Ardennes, and France fell, and it was a disaster because they designed something that they saw fit. I don't think we've designed entirely the right defenses, and that's why my concern with proxies is so acute, because I've heard your discussions, people quite legitimately admit that foils the system. If someone doesn't give the money directly, the Prime Minister has talked about the consulate giving the money directly. If the consulate gives the money to someone who then gives it to someone else, who then passes it on, the effect is as problematic. That's what we have to get at. We have to have other systems to back up the systems we have.
Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to follow along these lines. I saw Mr. Burton nodding his head, and I also heard his testimony. He mentioned that he agrees with Mr. Mulroney, and I heard the following. He said, we don't want to be looking over our shoulder, looking the other way. Now, I didn't hear anything about complacency, but I perhaps would like to hear him speak about this. I'd like to be able to answer to the voters in my riding with respect to what's happening in Canada and what should we be truly worried about given what we know, given the tools that we have. What do we need to do in terms of education? What should I be answering to the people I represent?
Well, I think that there is a problem within Canada of a lot of influence of Chinese benefits to people in positions of trust. When the Australian Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act came into effect in 2019, several Australian politicians, former politicians, resigned from lucrative boards, including the former Minister of International Trade, Andrew Robb, who resigned from an $880,000 a year private consultancy with a Chinese billionaire who had achieved a 99-year lease on the port of Darwin. So I do think that this kind of legislation has a dampening effect on people who might feel that that they need some funding for whatever purpose and that they can manage the conflict of interest aspect that may exist in it. So I do think a raising of awareness of this and providing some mechanisms that ensure accountability is significant, and that might encourage more champions within the government to take this matter more seriously and start pressing in Cabinet for the necessary legislation to try and bring our Canadian practices and laws up to the standards of other nations. And that would include laws with regard to the transfer of classified technologies, dual-use military technologies, to agents of a foreign state. We have a lot of trouble prosecuting these matters because our laws are not as strong as those of the UK and the US. So it's another area. There's just so many areas of concern about the challenge of China that we need to be able to address.
Mrs. Blaney, up to 6 minutes for you.
Well, thank you, Chair, and I'm going to direct my first questions to Mr. Johnson. I appreciated your testimony today, and I think, as we're discussing all of this, really what we're hopefully all going to come back to, despite our political differences, is how do we make sure our systems are strong enough? How do we make sure that we're building trust within Canada and holding all systems to account so that people have faith in our processes? That's something that I'm really aware of. But you talked a lot about disinformation and how many people are being pulled into that world, and they don't always have the tools that they require to evaluate it more objectively and understand where the source material is coming from. I definitely see that in my constituency, and I'm actually surprised in my role how many people send me articles just to say, is this true or not? And I am now given the capacity to decide for them, and that's not the role that I think an MP should take on. So I'm just wondering, you mentioned in your testimony the idea of having a national media literacy strategy to evaluate programs. So I'm just curious if you could expand on that and what that role could potentially look like. And within that, I'm also very curious about what sort of digital media literacy awareness we need to see focused. I represent a more rural and remote area of the world. Is there things that are specifically important for those communities? And for Indigenous communities, I think those are two groups that I represent that I'm particularly concerned about the impact of disinformation and how we get the proper tools to those communities to be able to address that in a meaningful way.
Thank you. Well, I'll start with the second part of that question. Our model of digital media literacy is composed of 4 competencies. The first of these competencies is access, the ability to access digital media and other media as well. And it is the one that underpins the other 3 competencies, which are to use, to understand, and to engage with media. But we see access as underpinning the other 3 because, of course, you can't do any of the other 3 if you do not have access. And access is also unique in that it is both a skill and a condition, because we need to provide full access to digital media to everyone in the country. And we know that as a country, Canada generally does have good internet access, but we also know that there are pockets. There are places where internet access is slow or unreliable. We know from our research with teachers that internet access within schools is frequently unreliable. And that's undeniably a much bigger issue in rural areas, in remote areas, among Indigenous and Northern communities. So we need to be committed to finishing the job of providing every Canadian with good quality, reliable internet access. And of course, that means in every school as well. And we need to be teaching those access skills because one of the issues is that many people do face barriers beyond simply being able to access it technically. In many cases, there are barriers caused by disability. There are barriers caused by language. There are barriers caused by poor literacy skills, and of course, by poor digital literacy skills. And so those elements, breaking down those barriers, must be a component of a digital literacy or digital media literacy plan for the country. So equitable access is certainly an important part. It's also really important to ensure that it is a whole of society plan, because we know that no one has grown up with these technologies, that adults are just as much in this position of needing to become more digitally media literate than young people are. We can't kick the can down the road by only covering it in K-12 education. And of course, we need to build a plan that draws connections between the different levels of government so that each level of government is playing a role in the strategy that makes sense and that is complementary to the other ones. And finally, of course, digital media literacy programming for all sectors needs sustainable funding so that we don't wind up in the situation that we've had where terrific programs get rolled out and either cannot continue because funding ends or cannot be maintained, because we know that issues change. We know that new concerns arise. We knew that new platforms become popular. And so there needs to be a provision to make sure that the programs that are being offered at all levels are maintained and updated on a regular basis.
I have 20 seconds. If you could add that on to my 2:20 or 2:30, that would be great.
Thank you. I do want to just take a moment to say I really am appreciating the pace in which we're speaking for purpose of interpretation and the fact that one person is speaking and then the other person. So I hope we can continue with this because it's very good. So I want to commend you all for your good work. Monsieur Berthold, jusqu'à 5 minutes.
Mr. Berthold, you have up to 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. I'd like you to try and keep your responses brief because I do have several questions that I'd like to put to you. My first question is for Mr. Mulroney. Mr. Mulroney, you were very active on social media, and you said that the example has to be set at the highest level, including the Prime Minister himself. And you said,
fixated on demonizing domestic critics, fomenting even deeper division at home. CCP couldn't be happier. Could you repeat why you said that?
My experience comes, the thing that shaped my thinking about this is my experience on the Manly panel post-Afghan, and we were deciding about extending the mission in Afghanistan. The mission was failing because Foreign Affairs was doing its thing, CETA was doing its thing, Canadian forces were doing something else. And the recommendation that came from the panelists, they had a number of recommendations, the government took them all, but the first was that the Prime Minister had to lead. You can't get all the uncoordinated and disparate parts of government to work together unless they have very firm and direct leadership. They're looking to see what is coming from on high, and I don't think they're seeing it clearly enough.
So you don't think the Prime Minister is currently doing enough to counter foreign interference?
Yes. I mean, I think his China policy took a long time in, I think, getting on the right track. I think he was originally, and he has said himself, naive when it came to China, and the country has paid a price for that. But I haven't seen the actions to follow up on that new understanding, that new awareness of China.
Mr. Burton, vous avez dit...
Mr. Burton, you said that Chinese influence can be spread through the United Front work, and it can benefit influential people, too. We learned there were Chinese business people who gave $1 million to the father of Justin Trudeau's work. Can you tell us more about this influence through the Chinese regime? That is to say, they infiltrate the Canadian system, and through the banks, they can influence politicians.
Yes, I mean, that particular instance some years ago, I believe that the person who coordinated the joint donation to the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation was a member of the Standing Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which is the lead United Front coordinating body in China, and that he had been attending a fundraiser for the Prime Minister held in the home of a person, Canadian of Chinese origin. He was not a Canadian and therefore could not donate to the Prime Minister, but everybody else, I believe, all of them looking to me from the photographs that appeared on mainland Chinese, overseas Chinese newspapers. In other words, the photographs of who was in the party initially appeared in China, not in Canada. On the Prime Minister's schedule, I believe it was identified as private meetings, were all Chinese faces, and imagine they all could well have given the maximum allowable under law. The question is, you know, this issue, as Mr. Mulroney has pointed out, of proxies, and it's extremely difficult for us to note, and we certainly cannot make allegations against Canadians without evidence for that, and we don't have any evidence.
Monsieur, vous avez...
You also mentioned that you feel that a massive amount of disinformation is coming through in the Chinese language. Now, during the last election, there were reports that the Conservatives may be a minority government. And Mr. Chu, for example, could have been a victim of this. So do you feel that Chinese influence could actually affect the outcome of the elections in certain ridings?
Is that for me? Yeah.
For both of you.
I think that, I mean, obviously we don't know, why people put an X next to what candidate they put it to, what factors inform that decision. But, within Canada, with the exception of the Falun Gong media, the Epoch Times, which I do not regard as a reliable source of information, they are all well identified as being under the control of the People's Republic of China. There are no Canadian Chinese language newspapers which do not reflect the views of China.
Est-ce que selon vous...
But Mr. Burton, do you think that this had an impact on the outcome of the elections? Did you feel that this
have changed the result of the election?
My subjective judgment was that the impact was enormous, and people like to believe negative things. It's much more appealing than positive things. And my personal view is that if it had not been for that disinformation, Mr. Chu would still be in Parliament today.
So respectfully, we can make the beep beep go longer if that would help. I just don't think it helps, but I'll leave that with all of us because we are able to do well. Ms. O'Connell, 5 minutes to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you. Mr. Mulroney, during your tenure as ambassador, I'm just curious, did you ever make a recommendation for a registry for China to the government that you served?
No, I did not.
And what was the reason for that? Or when did you realize that perhaps that was a mistake and something of this nature should be implemented in Canada?
Because when I was ambassador to China, my focus was on China. And when I retired and I wrote a book and I traveled across the country and I talked to people, I began to see the problem. Our problem wasn't in China. Our China problem wasn't in China. It was now in Canada.
But as ambassador, would you not?
But I talked constantly about the importance of security, threats to information, the need for ministers and members of parliament to guard their documents safely. I spent a lot. That was a real focus for me. And I met with all of the senior security people in Ottawa when I came back. We talked about what was happening. So no, that was a priority for me.
Okay, good. And then what was the government of the day's reaction? Like what concrete steps were then put in place to deal with the security threats and informing MPs and things like that?
Again, I wasn't back in Canada for how elections were run, but I think...
not just elections.
I think the government was appropriately security conscious when they were in... That's the only thing I could see is when they came to China, they were appropriately security conscious, as were other governments. I traveled to China with Mr. Chrétien and with Mr. Martin as well.
Okay. And so but you didn't have specific recommendations based on what you saw in your role to the government of the day?
I had a lot of recommendations about, I remember bringing together the economic deputy ministers and the defense and security deputy ministers to talk about the situation we were getting into back in 2010, 2011, where more than half of Canada saw China as this unlimited opportunity, and the other half saw it as a threat. And I said, we need to integrate this now. And I had some success in that, but not complete success.
Right.
But I was very conscious of the security, the situation vis-a-vis China. I'd also be an assistant deputy minister for Asia in Ottawa when Mr. Chrétien was prime minister, Mr. Martin, and I saw how the Chinese ambassador of the day worked then too, and I was very vocal about that.
Right, but subsequent measures needed to be implemented so that they would remain in place for successive governments. And those legislative or regulatory changes didn't happen. You mentioned the MP security or MP awareness. This was something I raised as a parliamentarian myself, that there's really little to no kind of briefings or training for MPs on how to even deal with that. So clearly that issue persisted even, past your time and
they
flagging
always got a
it.
briefing from me.
Absolutely. Thank you. Madam Chair, if I have time, I want to get to a question to Mr. Johnson. You spoke about literacy. My colleague, Ms. Blaney, raised about literacy. I want to and education. I want to quickly, if I have time, ask about legislation. I, as a Canadian, found it very concerning and upsetting to know that, for example, hashtags could be hidden in codes and programming for videos, and that Canadians wouldn't even know, unless they knew what to look for, that they themselves were being targeted. So is there a role for legislation or for governments also to require platforms some sort of awareness for Canadians that if there are hidden hashtags, the Canadians know they're being targeted, that you can't just hide coding for specific groups to then share?
I can't take a position on specific legislation, but what I can say is that there certainly is a role for appropriate legislation and regulation in addressing disinformation. And it is also, as the British scholar Sonia Livingstone has said, it is not possible to be literate in something that is not legible. And so in order for Canadians to be able to critically engage with the media that we consume, it needs to be at a certain level of transparency, whether that transparency has to do with making clear things like hidden hashtags, or whether it is about making clear how algorithmic decisions are made in delivering or recommending content.
Thank you. And I have very little time, but in terms of the use of local media by foreign state actors to somewhat legitimize, is that part of the literacy program you would also recommend?
I would say that the literacy program that we recommend and the programs that we currently deliver would address that. It wouldn't be targeted, it's not targeted specifically at that, but certainly any digital media literacy program is going to address how to evaluate whether or not a source of news is reliable and how to read news critically.
Thank you.
Thank you. Madame Gaudreau,
Ms. Gaudreau, you have 2.5 minutes. We're going to talk about the registry. And my question is for our two witnesses here. Yesterday, Minister Mendocino was called to the special committee, and he spoke about a toolkit, but he didn't really answer when we asked about how it could be implemented. And I'd like to hear you comment on this. It seemed that he was perhaps afraid of upsetting people or ruffling any feathers. He also spoke about stereotypes. And so here's my question. Do you think that the Canadian government is trying to perhaps quieten talk about interference in order to not upset any Chinese-Canadian relations, for example? Or perhaps they're just simply afraid of reprisals? Please take your time to expand on this.
Saw those comments, and I must say I was discouraged when I saw them, because there are a couple of things to consider. But the most important is that a lot of this, of what China is doing and its interference, the first victims are in the diaspora community. You know, the Chinese state will say to a Chinese student at a university, you know, we heard that you were speaking about independence in your class. That could be bad for your family back home. Or they say to Uyghurs, you'll never see your mother again if you keep this up. So not acting and finding reasons not to act, by all means, be careful, be sensitive, be respectful in terms of how we do it. But the very fact that you announce that you're doing it already sends a message to the Chinese, a very important message, a message we are not sending. So I would announce the registry, then do the consultations and hear from the Chinese community, but also hear from the Tibetan community, hear from the Uyghur community, hear from Falun Gong activists who are all being persecuted here in Canada by agents of the Chinese state who act like increasingly it's a little piece of China.
Oh, I think that, you know, certainly the legislation is by no means directed towards one group. It's called foreign. And so any foreign power that's involved in trying to interfere in Canadian affairs by providing benefits to people in the civil service or parliament in a position of trust should be made accountable. And, you know, it's not that you would simply declare benefits that you've received from one specific foreign state, but from any foreign state. So it's even. And the resistance to this idea.
Thank you. Mrs. Blaney, 2 minutes and 45 seconds.
Well, thank you. And my question I'm going to ask this time is of Mr. Mulrooney. So I found it interesting. You talked about the 4 points that you thought were priorities. And of course, it was the registry for the foreign agents, and then having Canadian police participate more fulsomely in ethnic communities. I believe I got that right. So I'm just curious about how those two things could potentially intersect, because I've heard things from different ethnic communities, for example, the Uyghur community, that have brought forward concerns or tried to bring forward concerns to RCMP and police, and it's like they just get passed around because nobody really knows how to address that issue, but the threat is real in Canada. So I'm just wondering, how could those two things coincide and support one another so that we have more supports for people in our own country that are under those threats that you both have mentioned so clearly?
I don't disagree with Mr. Mendocino's idea of a toolbox. We need the registry, but we need other things. And I think we need to train our police to be more aware of what's happening. I mean, the work that Charles is doing in going into the Chinese language press and hearing what people are saying and doing is more important than we think. We think that's obvious, but a lot of people aren't aware of what's being said here in Canada. So having police who can do that, who can understand the pressures that these people are in, and again, people who have every right to expect the protections of the police, instead of being told, oh, go check with the Chinese police, as if they somehow don't deserve our protection. So we need to do a much better job, but I see that as a separate priority itself.
Oh, sorry. So how... I guess, you know, when you look at all of the things that we're talking about, the threats to our political systems, the influence that particular groups can have, I'm just wondering, you stated very clearly that we need to have that foreign agents registry put into place, make that stance, and then get on to the consulting. Who would be at the top of the line, and I'll ask both of you, to do the consulting with to make sure that this happens, and what will that action do to impact China and what it's doing in Canada?
Well, I mean, you know, the Canadian Coalition on Human Rights in China, which is an organization that I've been advising since 2005, coordinated by Amnesty International, consisting of Tibetans, diaspora groups, Uyghurs, Falun Gong, democracy activists, and many others, have been requesting that there be a proper government agency that would address when they are being harassed by agents of a foreign state. You know, there's some Hong Kong activists that get threatened with rape, young women that really should be able to have someone there that would address this and give them a sense that they're safe again. I think in terms of foreign influence, these groups, you know, Chinese groups and other groups, would be important to reassure that the legislation is not requiring that they all register with the state and that they all have to report all of their connections with China, but that it's about people who are in positions of trust, who are receiving benefits from a foreign state, should publicly declare it.
We're going to do a quick 2-minute round. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To Mr. Mulrooney and Mr. Burton, CSIS advised the Prime Minister that when it comes to foreign interference, the policy of government should be grounded in transparency and sunlight. Repeatedly throughout the fall, we've seen talking points from this government that the 2019 and 21 elections were free and fair, that they weren't compromised, and then they rely or cite the independent election panel findings, even though the findings of the election panel was that the overall integrity of the election was not compromised, something very different. And so in the face of that, is it your opinion that this government is being transparent with Canadians about the degree of interference in our elections from Beijing?
I think that, CSIS, compared to the intelligence services of our like-minded allies, is much less forthcoming about what's going on. And therefore, we need more information about what they know about what sort of interference may have taken place. So I don't know what the basis for the judgment is that everything was okay and didn't affect the election. I'd like more detailed information to be able to make that assessment. When you look at something like the balloon incident, on the 14th of February, or 15th of February, the entire Congress will be getting a security briefing on this matter. I'd like to see the entire House of Commons given security briefings so that our members of Parliament have a better understanding of the truth of matters and can form legislation and make decisions accordingly.
Mr. Mulrooney?
I think that the bar is way too low when you say that it has to affect the outcome of the election. Affecting one constituency disenfranchises Canadians and is a big win for China. Interfering in 11 is a major, aggressive step by China.
The threshold is too high.
Thank you,
the bar's
Mr.
too
Cooper.
Sorry,
Mr.
yeah,
Mulrooney.
right.
Thank you. Excellent. Mrs. Sahota, up to 2 minutes.
Chair. Oh, it's on. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the panelists today. I think you've provided really great information, and I know that me and probably many members around this table are really intrigued by the idea of also implementing a registry, which could be implemented for foreign actors, but also for disinformation. Those ideas have both been presented to this committee before as well. What I did want to know, though, from you is also, having a diverse community that Canada has with huge diasporas from many countries that we've heard from CSIS about playing an active role in interference in our elections. However, I quote again the Chief Electoral Officer that the threshold we currently have, that any interference that has been happening for many past elections has not risen to the point of having a material impact on the election. But having said that, I still want to know your opinion, because I heard some comments being made about, looking at images of fundraisers and seeing Chinese faces and making the assumption then that perhaps those Chinese faces could have been influenced by foreign state actors. And don't we have to be a little bit careful living in a country with so many different multicultural communities that we don't level accusations and don't hinder the participation of communities from those different minority groups in the electoral process?
Yeah, can I take that one? I mean, at that particular fundraiser, the presence of a representative of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference did raise flags for me, because that's the coordinating body for United Front work. But I absolutely agree with you. In our country, we want to have full representation of all of the ethnic groups that make up our nation, and we want to encourage more Canadians of Chinese origin to actively participate in our politics and represent their communities. But these representatives have to be committed to liberal democracy and Canada, and not have, potential mixed loyalties to what they refer to as the motherland, and that's not Canada.
Okay. So, Mr. Johnson, I see your hand up, but I'm sorry, we've run out of time. But if you want to provide us something in writing, I'm sure committee members would welcome that from all witnesses. So please do not feel that the conversation has to end. You can provide us information. I do want to thank you, Mr. Johnson and Mr. Mulrooney and Mr. Burton, for giving us your time and being with us today. Committee members, just really quickly, we had a reception today. We'll have another reception, informal reception, on Thursday, which means we brought a couple of snacks in for our guests, and I just want to make sure that it is suitable for the clerk to be able to order those snacks so that we have them available again on Thursday. So your motion has been passed for your budget. Brilliant. With that, have a great day. See you on Thursday. Thank you.